The glass salt shaker was slightly sticky, the metal lid dented from years of refills, and when you tapped it twice against your palm, a little white drift fell onto a basket of fries that arrived wrapped in wax paper. The booth vinyl sighed when you slid across it. Somewhere behind you, a spoon clinked against a thick milkshake glass, and the door chime gave a polite jingle as someone else came in out of the parking lot's sun. That was dining out in 1960s America. Not a performance, not an event, just a small ceremony tucked into the week, with its own sounds and rules and tiny surprises. If you lived through that decade, you might remember how eating out felt both ordinary and special at the same time. It wasn't something most families did every night. It might have been Friday after payday, or Sunday after church, or the one evening a month when the kitchen lights stayed off and someone said, "Let's go." We'll come back to that phrase later, because it carried more meaning than it seemed. For now, just sit in the booth and look around. The air was a mix of coffee, fried onions, and that faint sweetness of pie cooling somewhere nearby. In many towns, big cities like Chicago or small farming communities in Iowa, the local diner had a personality of its own. Maybe it was a narrow storefront with a counter and spinning stools. Maybe it was a low, wide building with a big parking lot and a sign shaped like a coffee cup. In some places, you might have recognized the glowing arches of McDonald's or the orange and brown stripes of Howard Johnson's from down the road. Those names meant something then. They weren't just food. They were landmarks. At home, dinner might have been meatloaf on a Tuesday and tuna casserole on a Thursday. But when you went out, the menu felt like a passport. Suddenly, there were club sandwiches with toothpicks and little paper frills, shrimp cocktails in chilled glasses, and desserts listed on a small blackboard in careful chalk. Even if you ordered the same cheeseburger every time, the act of choosing felt grown up. Did you ever trace your finger down the laminated menu, pretending to consider the steak even if you knew it wasn't happening? That tiny pause, right there, was part of the ritual. In many households, there were unspoken rules. Children were expected to sit up straight, elbows off the table, napkin in your lap. If you needed ketchup, you asked politely. The restaurant wasn't your kitchen. It belonged to everyone. And somehow, that made it feel bigger than you. You might remember the way your parent would clear their throat softly if you got too loud. Not angry, just a reminder. We'll come back to that throat clear later, because it shows up again in a different way. Let's step into a kitchen scene for a moment. It's late afternoon. The kitchen at home smells like dish soap and the faint iron scent of the stove cooling down. Someone says, "I'm not cooking tonight." There's a pause, a look. Then the sentence, "Let's go out." Coats are pulled from the hall closet, a quick comb through your hair. Maybe your shoes are wiped with a damp paper towel. The house is left quiet, the porch light flicked on, even though you won't be back until after dark. In the car, the vinyl seats are hot at first. The radio hums. No one quite knows where you're going yet, but everyone is already halfway there in their mind. For many families, the drive-in restaurant was its own adventure. Carhops balancing trays hooked onto half-rolled windows, the menu clipped to the door. In places across California and Texas, you might have pulled into a lot where teenagers worked summer shifts, chewing gum and skating between cars. There was something thrilling about eating in the front seat, careful not to tip the root beer. Did your parent warn you not to slam the car door because the tray might fall? That warning had a particular tone, half serious, half amused. Inside traditional sit-down restaurants, the lighting was soft, sometimes even dim. There were those little glass lamps on each table in some places, or a candle in a red holder that dripped wax slowly down its side. The waitresses, often called by their first names on little badges, moved with practiced efficiency. "Honey, they might say, or sweetie, without it feeling strange. Orders were written on small pads, coffee was poured before you asked, the pot tilted just enough to keep the cup full, and the handle always faced you. That detail mattered. And then there was the jukebox. In some diners, it stood against the wall, glowing with curved chrome and colored lights. You might have slipped in a coin to hear the Supremes or the Beatles, and for 3 minutes, the whole place seemed to share your choice. That was a quiet kind of power, to choose the soundtrack of the room. Not everyone approved, of course. Somewhere, a parent might have raised an eyebrow at a song they didn't quite understand. There's that throat clear again. Different setting, same gentle boundary. School nights were different. Eating out midweek was rare for many, but sometimes, after a school play or a Little League game, the team would gather at a pizza place with red checkered tablecloths, paper cups, a pitcher of soda sweating in the center. The crust was thick, the cheese stretching in long strings that threatened to snap back onto your shirt. You laughed too loudly. You didn't care, because this wasn't about the pizza. It was about sitting at a table with your friends and feeling, just for an hour, like the world was wide open. And picture an evening scene. The restaurant is fuller than usual. It's Saturday. The hostess flips through a small book with penciled reservations. There's a fish tank near the entrance, and you stand there watching the bubbles rise. Your name is called. The booth this time is near the window. Outside, the neon sign flickers. Inside, forks and knives create a soft rhythm against plates. Your parent leans back, loosens their tie just slightly, and smiles in a way that looks different from weekday smiles. The food arrives steaming. You reach for the salt shaker, the same slightly sticky one from the beginning, and shake it twice. Dining out also meant learning how to wait. Orders took time. There were no buzzing devices to check, no glowing screens to disappear into. You might have folded your napkin into shapes or read the sugar packet jokes printed in tiny letters. Maybe you stared at the dessert case and tried to decide between lemon meringue and chocolate cream. The waiting was part of it. It built anticipation. It gave you space to notice the way your family sounded when they talked without rushing. Not everything was glossy or perfect. Some restaurants had chipped plates. Some coffee was burnt. Sometimes the steak was tougher than you hoped. And yet, there was an understanding that this was a shared space, run by people who knew your name, or at least your face. In smaller towns in Ohio or Kansas, the waitress might ask about your grandmother or your new job. You weren't just a table number. You were part of the week. Of course, the 1960s were not the same everywhere. In big cities like New York City, you might have tried foods that felt exotic then. Chinese takeout folded into little white boxes, or Italian restaurants with checkered floors and candle bottles covered in wax. In coastal towns, seafood shacks served clams in paper baskets with a squeeze of lemon. In the South, fried chicken came out golden and crackling, set down with a nod that said, "Careful, it's hot." Each region had its own flavor, its own pace. Let's step outside for a street moment. It's summer. The sun hasn't fully set. You're walking home from the corner diner with a paper bag that's already translucent from grease. The sidewalk is warm under your shoes. Someone down the block is mowing their lawn. You peek into the bag to make sure the extra order of fries is still there. A car passes slowly, windows down, music drifting out. For a second, the whole street smells like salt and oil and cut grass. You feel rich, even if the meal cost just a few dollars. There were also the small embarrassments. Dropping a fork and waiting for a replacement. Mispronouncing something on the menu. realizing you didn't know which fork to use in a slightly fancier place. But those moments taught something gentle about navigating the world. You learned by watching. You noticed how adults held their cups, how they signaled for the check with a glance rather than a wave. And when the bill came, there was often that quiet math at the table. Coins counted, a tip left under a saucer. Maybe you were told to place it there yourself, a tiny lesson in appreciation. Television had its influence too. After seeing diners and restaurants on shows like The Dick Van Dyke Show or Happy Days, even if one came later, you recognized pieces of your own life on the screen. The booths, the laughter, the way people gathered over coffee to talk things through. It felt familiar because it was. We should talk about that phrase again. Let's go. It wasn't shouted. It was decided. It often followed a long week, or good news, or sometimes no reason at all beyond wanting a break from the stove. That phrase carried relief. It meant dishes could wait. It meant someone else would bring the plates and clear them away. For many parents, that was a quiet luxury. And you might not have understood it fully at the time. There's a bittersweet note here, too. Not everyone could afford to go out often. Some families saved for it. Some children watched classmates talk about restaurants they had never visited. And the 1960s, for all their brightness, were also a time when not every dining room welcomed every person equally. That's part of the truth of the era. The counter seat wasn't always available to everyone. Remembering the warmth doesn't mean ignoring that reality. It means holding the whole picture with honesty. And yet, for so many, dining out became a thread that stitched weeks together. Birthdays marked by a special dessert with a candle. First dates awkwardly navigating milkshakes with 2 straws. Grandparents insisting on paying. The sound of a screen door closing back home later that night. The porch light still on. You step inside and the house smells different because you weren't cooking. It feels like you've borrowed someone else's world for a few hours and then returned to your own. Do you remember the first time you were allowed to order for yourself? Not whispering to a parent, but speaking directly to the waitress. "I'll have the..." There was a flutter in your chest, a sense that you had crossed a small, invisible line into independence. And when the plate was set down in front of you, exactly what you had asked for, it felt like proof that your voice carried weight. Now think about the end of the meal. The check arrives in a small folder or tucked beneath a plate. Chairs scrape softly as people stand. Coats are put back on. Someone reaches for a toothpick from a little glass holder near the register. The door opens. That chime again. Night air rushes in. For a brief second, you look back at the table you're leaving behind. The crumbs, the empty glasses, the salt shaker waiting for the next hand. If you're still here with me, I'd love to know something very specific. What was the name of the restaurant your family went to most often in the 1960s? And what did you always order there, even if you pretended to consider something else? And do you remember a particular rule you had to follow at the table that makes you smile now? Maybe something about manners, finishing your plate, or not touching the jukebox without asking. If this brought back a familiar smell or sound for you, consider subscribing so we can keep revisiting these small, ordinary moments that shaped us more than we realized. The salt shaker is still in your hand, and somewhere in the background, a spoon taps once more against a thick glass, steady and unhurried.